The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous frequency as Hannah Clarke pushed through the Oak Creek Memorial Nurses Station at 0557, 2 minutes before shift change. Her coffee was already lukewarm. She'd made it at home, forgotten it in the car for 20 minutes while she sat in the parking lot watching other people walk in like they belonged there. Her scrubs were a shade of blue that disappeared into the background of every hallway. This was deliberate. The night shift nurses were gathered near the central monitors, their voices creating that particular texture of exhaustion that only happens at the edges of consciousness. When Hannah approached, there was a small silence. Not hostile. Just absent. The kind of silence that follows when someone walks into a room and nobody bothers adjusting their conversation. One of them, a Melissa, who'd been here 3 years longer, glanced up, nodded without smiling, and turned back to her charting. Hannah set her coffee down on the counter beside the patient roster and began reading the overnight admissions. Major James Whitmore, 48 years old, admitted at 0247 via life flight from Houston Regional Trauma Center. Sanjin Valley IED blast, 72 hours post-incident. Catastrophic pulmonary contusion, fractured left tibia, 8 separate lacerations requiring surgical repair. Listed as ICU care, room 214. The chart noted heavily sedated on morphine protocol, expect minimal responsiveness. She traced her finger down the vital signs column. Blood pressure holding at 108/71. Heart rate steady at 64. O2 saturation 94% on supplemental oxygen. The information arranged itself in her mind like a map, territory to understand before she walked into the room. Dr. Hargrove was at the far end of the nurses' station, his Rolex catching the overhead light as he scrolled through something on his tablet, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Hannah had seen that smile before. It was the expression of someone who'd discovered a problem that he could weaponize into an advantage. His lab coat was pristine white, unstained by any actual contact with patients. He looked up as she reached for her assignment clipboard and held her gaze for 2 seconds longer than necessary. Then he returned to his tablet without acknowledging her. This was worse than hostility. This was the moment when she became interesting to him. She carried the patient roster toward the ICU corridor, her shoes making barely any sound against the polished tile. This had taken practice, walking in a way that didn't announce presence. Years of practice, if she was being honest with herself. The kind of practice that happened when you spent 12 years moving through spaces where being noticed meant being targeted. The kind of practice that didn't just disappear because you changed uniforms from combat fatigues to hospital scrubs. Room 214 was at the end of the west corridor, the one that always felt colder than the others because the HVAC unit was mounted outside that wall. She could hear it now, the mechanical wheeze and rattle of the cooling system, the sound of air being forced through conduits against resistance. Hannah pushed through the room's glass door quietly and stopped. The major lay on the hospital bed like something that had been carefully placed there and left to rest. His left leg was elevated in a traction frame, the skin around the incision site bruised in the particular pattern of deep trauma, yellowing at the edges where capillaries were reabsorbing blood. Gauze covered the surgical sites on his arms and torso. But it was his right forearm that held her attention. Block letters. Perfectly spaced. Dark tattoo ink applied by someone who knew what they were doing. The name stretched from his wrist to the inside of his elbow, Clarke. For letters, each of them the size of a postage stamp, arranged with military precision. Hannah stood motionless for approximately 4 seconds. Then she stepped to the bedside and checked the fall line, the drip rate, the catheter insertion site. Her hands moved through the assessment without requiring her attention. Threat scan. Breathing pattern, shallow but consistent. Pupil response to the small penlight she kept on her badge lanyard, both pupils equal and reactive. These were things her body knew how to do. These were things she'd learned before she was old enough to vote. The major's eyes remained closed. The morphine was doing its job. A bottle of phenylephrine hung from the four-pole, set to maintain his blood pressure while the sedation kept him from thrashing against the traction frame and destroying the surgical repair work. On the monitor, his heart rhythm was steady and predictable. His oxygen saturation read 94%. By every clinical measure, he was stable, holding ground. But something in her chest had started making a sound like distant thunder. She'd seen this tattoo before. Not in person. Never in person, because that memory had been cauterized out of her existence 6 years ago when she'd walked away from everything without leaving a forwarding address. She'd seen it in a photograph, printed on a surveillance photograph, the kind that got passed around classified briefings before being filed away in burn bags. The Major had gotten it done in Kandahar. She remembered the story because everyone in the platoon had remembered the story. Because tattoos meant something different when you were downrange. They meant something like a prayer. The Major's eyelids flickered slightly, the morphine dream cycling through whatever his brain was producing to fill the darkness. His lips moved without sound. Once, so quietly she almost missed it, he whispered, "Clarke." Hannah made no outward reaction. Her expression remained neutral. Her heart rate remained stable, she could feel it in her chest, the steady thump of a body trained not to betray itself in moments of physical stress. But her hands were gripping the forstand just a little too tightly. The metal was cold. That was a sensory detail worth noting. She finished checking his chart notes, recorded the morning vitals, and moved through the rest of the assessment with the mechanical precision of someone following a predetermined pattern. Pulses in the lower extremity, faint but present. Skin turgor normal. No signs of compartment syndrome. No new bleeding from the surgical sites. Everything that needed to be checked was checked. Everything that needed to be documented was documented. She was a nurse. She was good at her job. She was also someone else, and that someone else was a ghost who'd had the good sense to stay dead. Before she left the room, Hannah walked to the small closet where patient belongings were stored. A sealed bag with a hospital property label held what had arrived with the Major from the trauma center. She didn't open it. Instead, she stood in front of the closet for exactly one breath, then turned and walked back out into the corridor. The rest of her shift moved in the particular rhythm that only ICU nursing could create. Checking vitals every 4 hours. Adjusting for drip rates. Recording intake and output. The small mechanical rituals that meant the difference between a patient healing and a patient deteriorating in ways that nobody could quantify on a chart. She performed each task with the focused attention of someone who understood that medicine was the small distance between competence and catastrophe. At 14:30, after her shift had ended, she went to her locker in the break room. The institutional metal door opened with a sound like a sigh. Her jacket hung where she'd left it, the navy thing with the frayed sleeves and the small hole near the left pocket that she kept meaning to repair but hadn't. She reached into the lining and found the patch, the faded 75th Ranger Regiment insignia that she'd cut from her last issued uniform the night before she left. The stitching was worn. She could feel where her thumb had traced the edges of the fabric over and over again, touching it like a prayer or a scar. The colors had faded from the bright acid yellow and red of a fresh unit patch to something that looked almost vintage now, like something that had survived things. The thread connecting the patch to the lining was coming loose on one corner. She could fix that if she wanted to. She probably wouldn't. Hannah held the patch for approximately 8 seconds. Then she hung the jacket back up, closed the locker door, and left the hospital through the employee entrance without looking at anyone. The parking lot was hot. The Texas sun was doing what it always did, turning the asphalt into something that looked like it was melting. She sat in her car for a long time before starting the engine. The morphine dreams, she understood, were not always accurate representations of memory. The mind filled in gaps with fragments of experience, sounds, sensations, the echo of names spoken in darkness. When the Major had whispered Clarke, he might have been dreaming of someone else. Someone from his real life, his civilian life, the life that existed before the blast and the sedation and the hospital machinery that was keeping his body from following the damage that had been done to it. But she knew better. She'd learned to read the particular quality of recognition that existed below the level of conscious thought. She'd learned to see it in the way pupils dilated or contracted, the way breathing patterns shifted, the way hands clenched in sleep around nothing. The Major remembered her. He didn't know he remembered her, but he did. And that was the moment when everything that Hannah Clarke had built over the last 6 years started to come apart like old stitching. Dr. Hargrove pinned the disciplinary notice to the unit board during morning rounds, his voice carrying through the nurses' station like a tank idling in a garage. 23 staff members froze mid-stride, mid-keystroke, mid-breath. Nurse Clarke has been written up for an authorized deviation from established protocols, he announced, his finger jabbing the paper. Questioning attending physician decisions without clinical justification. The words landed methodically, each one a hammer strike. Hannah stood perfectly still at the medication cart, absorbing each word with one measured breath. Her hands did not tremble. Her jaw did not clench. A single tear traced down her left cheek, not from fear, but from the profound clarity of watching someone weaponize a bureaucracy against competence. She wiped it without breaking eye contact and said, "I did my job correctly, and we both know it." The room went dead silent. Hargrove's lips curled. He stepped closer, his white coat crisp as new money, his $8,000 watch catching the fluorescent overhead lights. "Do we, clipboard?" The nickname landed precisely where it was designed to land, reducing her to a task-oriented functionary, someone who shuffled papers rather than made decisions. Because pattern recognition suggests you struggle with authority and teamwork. He paused, letting the accusation settle into the silence. A nurse who can't follow orders isn't a nurse. She's a liability. Hannah's composure held like reinforced steel. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She reached back to the medication cart and continued preparing the morning for bags with movements that were economical, precise, military, the kind of hands-on discipline that comes from having to move fast in the dark with lives depending on accuracy. Around her, the other nurses exchanged glances. Some were sympathetic. Most were afraid. Hargrove had 3 board members in his pocket and a reputation for making people disappear from scheduling rosters if they questioned his authority. An hour later, Hannah sat down at the break room table with her lunch, a turkey sandwich and a bottle of water, the same meal she'd eaten for the past 6 years, nothing fancy, nothing that drew attention. 6 day shift nurses were already scattered across the room, their own lunches arrayed in front of them. The moment her chair touched the floor, they moved. Not quickly. Not obviously. Organized. Synchronized. One stood. Then another. Then another. Chair legs scraped in perfectly coordinated retreat. Bags were gathered. Conversations that had been happening 30 seconds before simply stopped. They filed past her like she was radioactive, like proximity might transfer whatever infection Hargrove had diagnosed her with. The door closed. Hannah sat alone at the table, her sandwich untouched, her water bottle sweating rings on the laminate surface. The break room hummed with fluorescent quiet. Through the small window in the door, she could hear the hospital resuming, the distant code announcements, the monitor beeps, the shoe squeaks on linoleum. The world did not pause for humiliation. The world kept moving. She picked up her sandwich. She ate it slowly, methodically, the way someone eats when they're not tasting anything at all. Pain was information. Isolation was data. The message was clear: stand with Hargrove or stand alone. He'd positioned her as a threat, and threatened people got cut from the herd. That evening, Hannah was outside room 214, checking the major's medications, when his daughter cornered her at the doorway. The woman was 23, expensive yoga pants, the kind of furious that comes from genuine fear twisted into something that looks like rage. Her voice was shaking. "Dr. Hargrove says you've been making mistakes with my father's care. He says you're not qualified for trauma cases. Why are you even assigned to him?" Hannah turned to face her slowly. Her hands remained at her sides. She did not reach for the door. She did not open her mouth. She did not defend herself. She simply stood there with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst thing that could happen, which meant that words from a frightened daughter were just noise. The woman's voice rose. "Answer me. You could kill him with your incompetence. My father is a decorated officer. He deserves better than someone who gets reprimanded for not following basic protocol. Hannah's jaw tightened once, then released. Her eyes remained level, locked on the daughter's, and she said absolutely nothing at all. Her fingers found the patch inside her jacket lining, that faded 75th Ranger Regiment patch sewn carefully into the fabric 6 years ago, a piece of her uniform she'd cut out herself the day she'd walked away. The patch was rough against her fingertips, a sensory anchor. A reminder. The daughter's face flushed. She made a noise of frustrated disgust and pushed past Hannah into the room. "I'm calling the patient advocate." "You're done." Hannah stepped aside and let her pass. At 0300, on Hannah's 4th consecutive night shift, the telltale hiss reached her ears from 30 feet away. It was the specific sound of air collapsing a lung, the exact acoustic signature of a tension pneumothorax, the same sound that had killed PFC Morrison in her arms outside Kandahar, the same sound that had made her ears ring in nightmares for 2 years. Her body knew it before her brain registered it. She was in room 214 before the monitor alarms triggered. The major was grey-lipped, his trachea deviated, jugular vein distended like rope beneath his skin. Classic signs. Critical time frame. The on-call resident, a third year who'd done maybe 5 chest tubes in simulation, stood fumbling with a tube kit, his hands shaking hard enough that the equipment rattled. "I need to page the attending," he said. "We need backup." There was no backup coming. There was no time. The major's oxygen saturation dropped from 92 to 88 to 75 to 68%, the numbers falling on the monitor like a countdown. Hannah's vision tunneled the way it always did when systems were failing and seconds meant death. She saw 18 faces, every life she'd saved in forward operating bases, every Marine and Army medic and Navy corpsman and civilian contractor who'd been 10 minutes from death and 10 minutes away from help. Every time she'd been the only one with training, the only one with nerve, the only hand steady enough. "Move," she said quietly. The resident blinked, confused, still holding the tube kit. "Move," she repeated, and her voice had dropped an octave. Not a request. A command. He moved. Hannah's hands were already in motion. Betadine swab applied at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the exact landmark taught in trauma manuals, the same landmark she'd used in the dark with a flashlight held in her teeth. 14-gauge needle. She palpated the landmarks with her left hand while her right found the needle, and she drove it home in one smooth motion, a motion that lived in muscle memory that predated her civilian life by half a decade. The hiss of air escaping. The released pressure. The major gasped, color flooding back into his face like someone turning a valve. 40 seconds. His vitals stabilized. Sinus rhythm. Oxygen saturation climbing, 70, 78, 85, 92. His eyes fluttered open, confused but alive. The resident was staring at her with something that looked like awe and something that looked like fear, the look someone gets when they realize the person next to them is not who they thought. Hannah stepped back, peeling off her gloves. Dr. Hargrove was standing in the doorway. He'd moved silently, the way certain predators move, and his face was completely unreadable. His eyes tracked from the major to the needle decompression setup to Hannah's steady hands to her composure, that impossible, military composure that didn't belong in a civilian nurse. He said nothing. He turned and walked away, his footsteps fading down the hallway toward the administrative offices where phone calls were made and favors were collected and narratives were rewritten. Hannah watched him go, her heart rate elevated but her breathing controlled, and she knew with absolute certainty that what had just happened in room 214 had changed the trajectory of her employment at Oak Creek Memorial. But that wasn't the worst part. By 0800, Dr. Hargrove had already made the first call. Hannah's former co-worker, Janet from day shift, saw him through the glass partition of his office, speakerphone activated, his voice carrying that particular edge it took on when he was performing competence for an audience. Patricia Chen. The cosmetic surgery magnate whose referrals had purchased Hargrove's lake house in the hill country, the one with the private dock and the $80,000 boat that Hannah had heard him mention twice in the physician's lounge with the kind of casualness that only comes from wealth he hadn't earned. Janet stopped pretending to chart and listened, her fingers frozen above her keyboard. "I need you to trust me on this, Patricia," Hargrove was saying, his voice the consistency of warm honey poured over broken glass. "She's a liability. Unilateral interventions, no team coordination. Just this morning, unauthorized deviation from protocol. Patient in 214. She made a clinical decision that should have gone through proper channels." Patricia Chen's response came through tinny and distant. "What kind of decision?" "The kind that could get us sued if it goes wrong," Hargrove said. It wasn't technically a lie. It was worse, it was a truth stripped of context, left bleeding on the floor like a patient after surgery. "I'm protecting the hospital. Protecting you. I need the credentialing committee to understand that we have a pattern of concern here." The line went quiet for 3 seconds. Then, "Patricia, I'll make a call." He hung up and checked his watch. 08 for 7. By 1000, he'd contacted her nursing school references. Hannah didn't know this yet, not consciously, but her body knew. She felt it as a tightness in her chest, the kind of pressure that comes before an explosion, before the air itself seems to hold its breath. It was the same sensation she'd felt in Sanjin when the patrol came back short 2 men and the radio went silent for exactly 4 minutes before command's voice cut through like a blade. That's when you knew. Before you knew. He'd called Dr. Maureen Walsh, the clinical director at Emory who'd written Hannah's final evaluation in nursing school. Hargrove's voice on that call had been different, more collegial, more carefully calibrated. Just a concerned colleague reaching out to another colleague about a shared professional responsibility. "I'm reviewing some clinical decisions made by one of your graduates," Hargrove had said, his words walking a line so precise it required a surgeon's steadiness. Hannah Clarke. Completed her program about 6 years ago. Dr. Walsh had confirmed it immediately. Hannah had been top of her class. Exceptional. "That's what puzzles me," Hargrove continued, and Hannah could imagine his frown, the one he perfected in front of mirrors. "Because what I'm seeing now is a pattern. Judgment issues during high-stress scenarios. Interventions that bypass the chain of command. I'm not saying she's incompetent. I'm saying I'm concerned about her decision-making under pressure. Did you ever observe anything like that?" The truth was constructed so carefully. Hannah had intervened in the 214 crisis. She had stepped outside protocol. Both of those things were true. What was missing, what was being surgically removed from the narrative the way a pathologist removes a tumor from surrounding tissue, was why. That a doctor was incompetent. That a patient was dying. That sometimes protocol becomes a coffin and someone has to break the lid. Dr. Walsh would have felt the weight of his concern, the institutional gravity of a hospital director reaching out about one of her graduates. She probably said something careful, something that acknowledged the possibility of concern without committing to it. Something like, "Hannah was always very confident in her own judgment." Sometimes that can manifest as what? Competence? Courage? By noon, Hargrove had gone nuclear. An outside risk management investigator from MedPro Consulting had arrived at Oak Creek Memorial carrying a leather portfolio and the kind of face that had reviewed 1,000 charts looking for something wrong and almost always found it. His name was Richard Vale, and he had the bearing of a man who'd made his career burying other people's mistakes. Hargrove had personally selected him from a list of 3 firms, the one with the highest settlement rate and the loosest interpretation of pattern of concern. Vale spread Hannah's documentation across Hargrove's mahogany conference table like evidence at trial, 6 months of her charting, her interventions, her decisions. 6 months of a life rendered as data, ready to be weaponized. Hannah saw this happening. Not directly, she wasn't privy to conference room conversations or phone calls made behind closed office doors, but she saw the investigator, a man in his 60s with silver cufflinks and shoes that had never seen a hospital floor before today, walking the unit with a tablet and that expression people got when they were looking for problems. She saw Vale photograph her shift notes. She saw him request her evaluation from preceptorship, her protocols from orientation, her incident reports. What she didn't see was that he was building a file, a narrative, a case. Her hands trembled when she changed the Major's dressing that afternoon. Just barely. Just enough that she had to set down the supplies and breathe through it, using the technique she'd learned in survival training: count the exhale longer than the inhale, control the nervous system through the breath. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 8. 8 counts on the exhale. That's where the power was. In the pause. In the refusal to let the body dictate. The Major was lucid. His eyes tracked her movements, and for the first time since he'd arrived, there was something behind them besides the fog of morphine and traumatic brain injury. His right hand, the one with her name tattooed in block letters down the forearm, reached out and touched her wrist. His grip was weak, but it was intentional. "Clarke," he whispered. His voice was the sound of gravel and sandpaper, a voice that had been screaming and then stopped. "I know you. Why can't I?" She didn't pull away. She let him hold her wrist while she finished securing the dressing, her movements precise and professional, the movements of a nurse. Not a person. Not someone with a history. Just a nurse. "Your body's healing," she said. 7 words. A sentence that contained nothing of the truth. The fog will clear. His 18-year-old son sat in the chair beside the bed, and Hannah had noticed the boy's eyes following her with the careful suspicion of someone who'd been fed information he didn't quite believe. His sister had called earlier. She'd heard the rumors already, somehow, the stories that traveled through families like infections. Something about Hannah's judgment. Something about the protocol deviation. Something about whether she should really be trusted with critical care. "Do you know my father?" the boy asked. His voice had that particular edge to it, the sound of someone defending territory he wasn't sure was his to defend. Hannah straightened the sheets with a precision that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with control. "I'm taking good care of him," she said. It was the right answer. It was also the only answer. It explained nothing and promised everything, and it would be filed away later by people who were very good at extracting meaning from fragments. She left before they could see her face crack. The bathroom on the 3rd floor, the one nobody used because the door stuck and the light flickered, that's where she went. She locked herself in a stall and pressed her forehead against the cold metal partition, feeling the tremor start at the base of her skull and move down through her shoulders like an earthquake registering on a scale only she could measure. But the tremor wasn't fear. It was something else. Something older. It was restraint. It was the accumulated force of 6 years of silence, 6 years of being someone else, of swallowing every instinct that had kept her alive in places where people died for hesitation. She counted to 8 on the exhale. 8 counts where she didn't scream. 8 counts where she didn't walk into Hargrove's office and tell him exactly what she was, what she'd done, what she'd survived. 8 counts where she stayed small. Her phone buzzed. A text from Janet: "He's building something against you. Whatever you did in 214, he's making it into a pattern. They have an investigator. I'm sorry. I heard him on the phone." Hannah stared at the message for exactly 3 seconds, then deleted it. Evidence was dangerous. Witnesses were liabilities. This was how you operated when you understood that the system wasn't built to protect you, it was built to protect itself. When she came back to the unit, Richard Vale was standing near the nursing station, tablet in hand, speaking quietly with 2 RNs she didn't know well. They stopped talking when they saw her. That was new. That was the sound of institutional gravity shifting. By 1400, Vale would recommend a comprehensive review of competency to Hargrove. By 1600, Hargrove would have 3 board members on speed dial. And Hannah would still be at work, still be changing dressings, still be the nurse that the Major called out for in his dreams, the one whose name he couldn't remember but whose hands he recognized as the ones that had carried him through darkness and into the light. She didn't know yet that this was the last shift she would complete at Oak Creek Memorial. She didn't know that security was being briefed. She didn't know that her career at this hospital was already dead, just waiting for the official time of death to be declared. But her body knew. And that's when the real nightmare began. The telltale hiss woke her before anything else. 3 in the morning. The kind of dark where the hospital stops pretending to be awake and becomes what it really is, a machine for keeping people alive or watching them die. Hannah was at the medication cart on the 4th floor when she heard it, that specific sound a human body makes when air leaks into the space around the lungs. A tension pneumothorax doesn't announce itself with sirens. It whispers. It hisses. It kills in minutes if you're not listening. Room 214. The Major. She moved before thought caught up, her feet carrying her down the corridor at a pace that looked casual to anyone not trained to recognize controlled urgency. The night shift was skeleton crew, one resident in the ICU 3 floors down, one nursing supervisor doing paperwork in a distant office. Hannah had 12 minutes before anyone else could physically arrive. Maybe less before the Major's oxygen saturation collapsed to the point where his heart would stop. She pushed through the door and found him grey-lipped, jaw clenched, one hand pressed against his right chest wall. His eyes locked on hers with the specific terror of a trained soldier who understood exactly what his body was doing. Subcutaneous emphysema had already started, air tracking under his skin like water under a bridge, distending the tissue of his neck, his shoulder, his collarbone. The ventilator hissed its mechanical rhythm beside him, pumping oxygen into lungs that couldn't use it because the pressure inside his chest had nowhere to go. Needle decompression, Hannah said, not a question. Her voice had already changed. Lower. Clipped. The voice of someone giving orders instead of taking them. I need a 14-gauge angiocath. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Now. She was already moving, hands moving on their own, hands that had done this in a forward operating base outside Sanjin with nothing but a field surgical pack and the sound of incoming fire. The muscle memory lived in her forearms, in her wrists, in the exact angle her shoulders needed to be at for precision under pressure. She grabbed the needle from the crash cart, 14 gauge, same as she'd used on 17 other soldiers whose lungs had collapsed from shrapnel, from blast pressure, from the physics of staying alive in places where survival required knowing human anatomy better than you knew your own name. Stay with me, she said to the Major, not softly, not gently. A command. The way you talk to someone drowning. The way you talk to someone you've already decided will live. Count backward from 10. She palpated the anatomical landmark, the rib, the space, the exact millimeter where the needle would pass through skin and muscle and intercostal tissue until it reached the air-filled void that had turned his lungs into a collapsing house of cards. The alcohol swab was cold against his skin. She drove the needle in with the kind of decisive motion that makes the difference between working and hesitating, between saving and losing. The hiss. The release. The explosion of trapped air escaping through a path it shouldn't have had to use. His oxygen saturation began climbing. 68%. 71, 78. His jaw unclenched. His eyes focused, not in relief, but in recognition. The kind of look a soldier gives someone who just pulled them from the burning wreckage of a Humvee. Hannah stepped back from the bed just as Hargrove appeared in the doorway, his face moving through 5 different expressions in 3 seconds. Surprise. Anger. Calculation. Decision. Something that looked like the moment a man chooses which path his life will take next. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the needle in the Major's chest, looked at Hannah, looked at the monitor showing a heart rate stabilizing, an oxygen level climbing back into the land of the living. Then he turned and walked back down the corridor. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 12 hours later when Hargrove called her into his office at 1400, his mahogany desk between them like a border neither of them would cross. His voice was calm, the kind of calm that belongs to men who have already decided your fate and are simply reading it to you from a script. 2 security officers stood outside the door. Hannah could hear them shifting their weight, could hear the static of their radios. Your employment at Oak Creek Memorial is terminated effective immediately, Hargrove said, not looking at her, looking at the personnel file open in front of him like a judgment that had already been rendered. Pattern of unauthorized interventions. Poor teamwork. Clinical judgment concerns. Hannah's voice came out steady, the way it always did, the way it had learned to do in places where wavering meant people died. He would have died. That's not your call to make, Clarke. Hargrove's eyes finally met hers, and there was something in them that looked like victory. Something that looked like a man who had decided that saving the Major's life was somehow the same as losing the game. You violated chain of command. You should have waited for the attending. You should have called a code. You should have followed protocol. Protocol would have killed him. That's not your assessment to make. He pushed a termination form across the desk. Her signature on the bottom line made it official. Made it permanent. Made it the kind of decision that changes what comes after. Security will escort you out. Hannah didn't sign it. She didn't need to. The two officers who came through the door had already made the signatures irrelevant. They were young, probably not much older than the Major's son, and they looked uncomfortable, the way people look when they've been asked to enforce someone else's cruelty. Hannah stood, gathered the small cardboard box of her belongings, the photograph of her sister, the coffee mug with the fading logo, the jacket she kept at her locker, and walked toward the door with her shoulders back and her eyes forward. The main lobby of Oak Creek Memorial is designed to be soothing. Soft lighting. Skylights. Water fountains that sound like falling rain. At 1400 on a Wednesday, it's also where the evening shift arrives in clusters, hanging up coats, laughing about lunch plans, transitioning from their lives outside to their lives inside these walls. 30 people watched Hannah Clarke walk through that lobby carrying a cardboard box, flanked by security, her name already scrubbed from the OR board upstairs, her access badge already revoked, her 12-hour shifts already reassigned to nurses who had never risked their careers to save a man whose face she didn't recognize. Someone started to say something. Hannah caught the movement from the corner of her eye. A friend maybe, someone from the day's shift who knew her name, who had eaten lunch with her in better times. But the moment passed. The sound in the lobby didn't stop, exactly, but it changed. The way a forest changes when a predator moves through it. Conversations didn't pause. They just became quieter, more careful, the way people talk when something important has just died and nobody knows yet what to say about it. She drove to her apartment in Houston in silence, her hands numb on the wheel of her decade-old Honda, the cardboard box sliding around on the passenger seat. She didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She did what she'd been trained to do since she was 23 years old. She compartmentalized, she moved forward, she accepted that sometimes survival meant losing everything else. That evening at 1900, Hannah sat in the waiting room of the Houston Veterans Affairs Medical Center with intake paperwork shaking in her hands. Not from fear. From something closer to the moment before a breach, that instant before you go through a door knowing that everything on the other side will be different, knowing that surrender and admission are sometimes the only forms of courage left. The waiting room was filled with men in faded unit shirts. 3rd Infantry Division. Marines. One man with a 75th Ranger Regiment patch on his jacket shoulder, the same patch that Hannah kept sewn into the lining of her own jacket, hidden against her ribs like a secret that had been eating her alive for 6 years. A woman in an Army physical therapy shirt called a name. An older man with a prosthetic leg stood up and moved toward the back. Hannah looked down at the form. Question 9, reason for visit. She wrote, PTSD evaluation, service connected. Question 12, branch of service. Navy. Question 15, rank. Her hand hovered there for 3 long seconds because writing it down meant making it real, meant admitting that the woman sitting in the cardboard box apartment, stocking shelves at a medical supply store, taking abuse from a surgeon who had no idea what she was capable of, meant admitting that she wasn't really that person at all. She wrote, Senior Chief Petty Officer. A nurse called her name 10 minutes later and walked her back to an office that smelled like coffee and fluorescent lights and the particular despair of people who had seen the worst of what human beings could do to each other. Hannah sat in a metal chair across from a woman in navy scrubs with grey streaking through her dark hair, a small bronze star on her collar. I've been hiding, Hannah said. Her voice didn't shake. It never shook. It was just her saying the thing that needed to be said. Since I left the service. Sanjin. The major in my hospital. He has my name tattooed on his arm and I thought he didn't remember me but he did. He remembered. And I couldn't admit why I was there with him. Couldn't tell anyone who I am. Couldn't tell my family. My sister. My parents. I just walked away and became someone else and it's been 6 years and I think I'm drowning. The psychiatrist, Commander Sarah Chen, her name tag said, didn't write anything down. She just looked at Hannah the way people look at you when they've been trained to see through the uniform, through the composure, through every wall you've built between your past and your breathing. The way people look when they know exactly what Sanjin costs. You saved someone's life today, Commander Chen said. I lost my job. But you saved a life. Chen leaned forward. Tell me about Sanjin. Hannah opened her mouth. And for the first time in 2,191 days, she started telling the truth. Exactly 48 hours after security escorted her through the lobby with a cardboard box, Hannah was stocking shelves at MedSupply Plus when her phone rang. It was Christine, the oncology nurse who'd abandoned her in the break room. But Christine's voice now carried something different, breathless urgency mixed with something close to awe. Hannah. Turn on the news. Any channel. Now. She didn't ask questions. She pulled up the hospital's local news feed on her phone, standing between boxes of surgical gloves and trauma shears, and watched as 3 UH-60M Blackhawks descended toward Oak Creek Memorial's helipad in tight formation, their rotor wash visible even on the small screen, sending rain sideways across the tarmac. The anchor's voice cut through. Unusual military presence at the hospital this afternoon. A SEAL team commander has reportedly arrived demanding to speak to someone by a specific name. Sources say it's a nurse. Hannah's hand steadied. Not shaking. Never shaking. This was what she'd been running from for 6 years, and now it was landing on a hospital rooftop. She didn't ask permission. She clocked out and drove back to Oak Creek Memorial in silence, crossing the same lobby where Hargrove security had made sure every nurse watched her carry that box. The automatic doors slid open like a mouth swallowing her whole. The elevator rose. The floor was wrong, too quiet. No code announcements. No monitor beeps from the hallway. The nurse's station was empty. Every face had turned toward the ICU waiting room where 3 operators in navy dress uniforms stood like statues, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the absolute worst. Their presence made the air pressure change. She walked forward without hesitation. And the room went exactly as silent as a held breath. The SEAL commander turned. His face carried the deep tan of someone who'd spent 2 decades in places sunlight reached just to burn, and his eyes held something ancient. Recognition. He nodded at her, small, precise, the kind of movement that meant everything. Senior Chief. Not a question. An acknowledgement of what had been true all along. Beside him, the major sat in a wheelchair, his head raised for the first time since he'd been admitted. His eyes were clear. Present. Lucid. His 16-year-old daughter was crying. His son, 18, built like his father, identical jawline, stood at attention beside the wheelchair with a precision that meant military family, that meant this moment had been prepared for. His voice cracked when he spoke, Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. It is an honor, Hannah didn't flinch at the rank. She didn't acknowledge the tears that were already streaming down faces around her. She stepped forward and looked at the major directly. Good morning, sir. Glad to see you lucid. Her voice had dropped half an octave. The timid hospital nurse was gone. What remained was someone who'd carried M4S through Sanjin Valley, who'd coordinated medevacs under fire, who'd made command decisions when every second meant the difference between a body bag and going home. The major's hand reached out, trembling, and she took it. His grip was weak but genuine. Clarke. God, I remember now. You carried me. 3 miles. Through, she squeezed once. Rest now, sir. We'll talk when you're stronger. A nurse Hannah had never seen stepped forward, tablet in hand, her voice shaking as she read from the screen. According to military records filed with the Pentagon, Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Marie Clarke, serial number N-847-462, completed 2 combat tours in the Helmand Province, 2016 to 2018. 14 commendations for Valor. 2 tours. 14. The nurse paused, steadying herself. It says here, her eyes lifted from the screen, wet. It says here you were decorated for providing tactical medical support under sustained fire and for, she couldn't continue. The SEAL commander stepped forward, and the room tilted. When commanders move, the world reorganizes itself around them. His uniform carried ribbons stacked in rows like a biography of wars fought on other people's soil. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of testimony. Senior Chief Clarke performed extraordinary medical interventions that saved the lives of 18 service members under combat conditions in Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, in support of 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. She received the Bronze Star for Valor. He paused. Breathed. The Bronze Star again for a second tour. And he looked directly at Hannah, and something like pride moved across his weathered face. A Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism. The Navy Cross, Senior Chief. And 2 Purple Hearts for wounds sustained in combat. The silence that followed wasn't silence, it was the sound of 6 years of lies collapsing. The sound of a hospital staff member realizing they'd been working next to a decorated combat veteran. The sound of understanding that they'd never known who they were standing next to at all. Dr. Hargrove stood at the ICU entrance, his face the color of old concrete. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. His hand gripped the door frame like it was the only thing keeping him upright, and for a moment, Hannah watched him do the arithmetic, the Navy Cross. 14 commendations. 2 Purple Hearts. The woman he'd fired for unauthorized deviation from protocol had been one of the most decorated medical personnel in modern naval history. His career wasn't just ending. It was being ended in real time in front of his hospital. She could see it happening behind his eyes, the understanding that he'd destroyed himself by trying to destroy someone he'd never understood in the first place. 2 FBI agents moved through the crowd with the steady purpose of people who'd been waiting for this moment. They didn't run. They didn't hurry. They simply walked toward Hargrove with the certainty of a sentence already written. Dr. Marcus Hargrove, you're under arrest for federal fraud, falsification of medical records, and billing irregularities tied to phantom diagnostic procedures on Medicaid and Medicare patients. One agent held up a tablet displaying the personnel file Hargrove had frantically tried to alter, backdated disciplinary notices, fabricated medication errors, a falsified incident report designed to justify Hannah's termination. His hands had left digital fingerprints all over the forgery. The hospital's system tracked every keystroke, every modification, every timestamp. His panic at 1400 when he'd realized Hannah was going to be believed had driven him to alter the documents himself, and that desperation had triggered automatic federal fraud alerts. The same billing scheme Hannah had questioned 48 hours earlier now proved exactly what he'd been protecting. Phantom CT scans. Kickback arrangements. The works. Handcuffs clicked around his wrists with the finality of a door closing on a life. The metal was cool. Clinical. You can't, I was protecting patient safety, his voice cracked like thin ice. 3 board members turned away in synchronized rejection, their body language screaming what they'd already understood, they'd been played by someone willing to destroy a nurse to cover his crimes. The SEAL commander's voice continued, steady as a metronome. The on-call resident has submitted a statement confirming that without Senior Chief Clarke's intervention during the tension pneumothorax event, Major Garrett would have experienced cardiac arrest within 4 minutes. She performed needle decompression at the second intercostal space in under 40 seconds. The resident stated he was not trained in the procedure and would have taken longer to assemble the chest tube kit. Senior Chief Clarke's actions saved his life. Again. Hargrove was walked through the same lobby where he'd orchestrated her humiliation. Past the same nurse's station where she'd been abandoned. Past the same break room where colleagues had fled from her like she carried contamination. He didn't look at anyone. His eyes were fixed forward, and there was something broken in his posture that suggested he finally understood the magnitude of what he'd done, and to whom he'd done it. Hannah stood perfectly still, watching him disappear into the elevator, one hand unconsciously touching the faded unit patch she still wore sewn inside her jacket lining. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. What she did was breathe, steady and controlled, while the Major's daughter approached with tear-streaked cheeks. "I'm so sorry. He told me you were dangerous." I believed him. Hannah's voice was quiet, the voice of someone who'd made peace with the fact that trust has to be earned through action, not words. "You were protecting your father. That's not something to apologize for." The daughter shook her head, still crying. "You saved him twice. Once in Sanjin. Once here. And I treated you like you were nothing." Hannah didn't correct her. She simply placed a hand on the girl's shoulder and squeezed once. That was enough. 6 months later, Hannah arrived at Oak Creek Memorial at 0600 wearing the navy blazer with Director of Trauma Services embroidered on the pocket. Her office overlooked the ICU where room 214 stood empty, cleaned and ready for the next patient who needed saving. On her wall hung a framed photograph, Major Garrett taking his first hesitant steps in physical therapy, his son and daughter on either side, and Hannah's hand steady on his shoulder, guiding him forward. Beneath it, mounted in a shadow box, was her Navy Cross, the citation reading "Extraordinary Heroism Under Fire," and on either side, her 2 purple hearts. Her phone buzzed at 0615. "The Major, coffee next week? Kids want to hear the real story." She smiled. The kind of smile that comes from finally being seen. Across Houston, in a community college basement, Dr. Marcus Hargrove demonstrated CPR compressions on a plastic torso for $18 an hour, teaching people how to save lives while his own medical license remained suspended pending federal trial. His lake house had sold 6 months prior. His retirement accounts were decimated by legal fees. His reputation was a ghost story nurses told each other in break rooms. At 0800, Hannah walked the ICU rounds with her trauma team, pausing at each bedside, listening to each nurse's assessment without interruption. A young RN fumbled through her presentation, intimidated by the hierarchy. Hannah waited, patient as stone. "Take your time." "I'm listening." Because she knew what it meant to be invisible, and she knew what it meant to be seen. By shift change, she'd pinned a commendation to the board. The oncology nurse who'd read her military file from the tablet, now transferred to trauma at her own request. That nurse would become her chief resident. That nurse would learn that courage looks like showing up, and integrity looks like speaking truth when silence is easier. Outside the hospital, dawn was breaking over Houston, catching the windows of Oak Creek Memorial in sheets of gold. Hannah stood at the ICU entrance and removed the faded unit patch from inside her jacket lining, the one she'd cut from her own uniform 6 years ago when she thought she needed to disappear. She walked to her office and framed it beside her Navy Cross. She didn't need to hide anymore. The patch belonged on the wall. The rank belonged spoken aloud. The decorations belonged visible, not buried under scrubs and shame. If you've been underestimated by someone who didn't know your value, or if you've worked somewhere that treated you like you were invisible, you know exactly what Hannah Clarke endured. Comment below, have you ever been judged based on appearances and proven someone dead wrong? And if you value stories about hidden strength, about justice served cold, about karma catching up to the people who abuse their power, hit subscribe and never miss a story about the quiet heroes among us. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark.